Organizations shape the world around us. It's time we shape them differently. Welcome to Orchestrate for Impact. Today I'm speaking with someone who brings sharp insight, deep integrity, and a powerful reframing of something we often overlook in organizational life: care. Dr. Lena Belin is a human-centered strategy and innovation advisor who spent the last 20 years helping organizations to evolve, redesigning their services, experiences, and ways of working, all to align with what people truly need. She's led CX, insights, innovation, and design teams across sectors, bridging the gap between people and the systems that shape their lives. And then something shifted. After becoming a carer herself, Lena began to see how even well-intended systems often design care out, making it invisible, optional, and entirely individualized. So rather than dismissing care as soft or sentimental, she now explores it as infrastructure, something strategic, something that can be designed, embedded, and essential to how organizations function and contribute. In this conversation, we explore how care can be a strategic asset and why any organization that wants to contribute meaningfully to impact must consider not just what it does, but how it does it. How does it hold? How does it support? And how does it relate to people along the way? Lena gives us a lot to think about. Enjoy. Welcome, Lena, to Orchestrate for Impact.
Thank you so much. So exciting. I'm great for being here.
I have had the great fortune of working with Lena, so I have a lot of admiration and excitement about the forthcoming conversation. How about you tell us, Lena, a little bit about who you are and maybe introduce the idea that we're talking about today around care. What does care mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose there's a couple of angles as usual that we can, tackle, that we can explore. From a professional perspective, I come from a background in design anthropology, strategic design, and customer experience strategy, and also research from a research lens. And so doing this sort of work in the innovation space, the strategy space over now almost 2 decades, which is scary, has afforded me to meet a whole wide range of people and spend quite a bit of time with them one-on-one. Part of the work, as you have been doing yourself, is to actually sit with people and really witness their experience without judgment as much as that's possible, and to then extrapolate that personal experience into systems. And so over time, or maybe just by how my brain's wired, I've gotten quite good at that, to really zoom in and zoom out and connect what's happening here for this person and for this type of person in their type of situation. Over time, you start to see patterns that connect to different systems, whether it's digital or government or business or, certain sectors. And that's kind of one strand. And so taking that thinking into my own personal experience of becoming a parent and then a carer, and going through that lived experience of what it's like to juggle multiple complexities, bringing those two together. And then the third part, which is the times that we live in, has really cemented for me that idea of care as being something that we can explore as a strategic lens and as a business lens, as an organizational lens. And in fact, we should do much more of that. The funny thing about care and talking about care is it feels a little bit silly because it is such a human trait. And my third part about the times that we live in, I think they really have been the catalyst for me to actually use that word care. I've been researching another facet of human experience, which is belonging. I did my PhD in that for quite a while, nearly a decade. But then it shifted into care because I think we couldn't have had this conversation even 5 years ago. So our systems, as they are continuing to squeeze people more and more from all ends, economically and in terms of social service delivery models and etc., care is really what's being not as much talked about, thought about, and is kind of designed. Well, that's my fear. It's being designed out of the systems that we use. And so therefore it's a timely conversation. That's my take.
So if we think about organizations as an entity, in and of itself, it's a shell, it's a holder, and it purports to care about particular things or not care about particular things. And of course, then underneath that, you have individuals who drive that or enforce that. And then you have the individual experience of care. And then you have the experience of care on the other side of the organization that perhaps is delivering service to or in service of that person. I'm wondering maybe if we can talk about it from those different angles in terms of what does it mean to design with care, design for care, to set up your organization to be caring.
Yeah, I love your framing. I think care it's a great word because it's a very relatable sort of human word. It feels emotional, but the distinction for me is when we apply it to organizations is it's not an emotion, but it's a strategic choice to care. And it's also kind of baked into the way that organizations operate and, as you would call it, are orchestrated. And at the same time, the people, the orchestrators, or the people who make this organization happen, they are also more or less, invested into that caring or not caring, into that way of being and working and achieving an outcome, I suppose. And the thing that I find intriguing and also important for us collectively to explore and to talk about more is that we make those strategic choices every day, whether we think about them or not. So the ethos of an organization, whether you're a nonprofit or or for-profit entity, etc., and by the values and what you're trying to achieve, those values, they guide your decision making. And then, of course, there's personalities on top, etc. But all of those, how you bring that to life, are choices. And the lenses that we tend to hear about in professional environments is the language and philosophy of quite old systems. So they're economic models that underpin, our thought and our action, where we think of time, for example, in units or people in units, etc. And there's good reason for that, because we need to be able, in order to remain viable, we need to scale certain things, etc. But what I'm offering for us to think about is that there are also other lenses that in the past they were kind of assumed and baked in to just how life was, care being one of them. And my point is that now, actually, especially with the rise of AI, that these assumptions around that what matters to us and how human interaction happens, that care principles that we would assume are kind of innate to us, they actually now need to be made more explicit. Just like our economic models that underpin organizations are kind of assumed, what we do with that is a different story. Some people would say we can change them, etc. But I'm saying that care needs to be another lens added into the mix. So yeah.
And what does it, so if you were to walk into an organization, can you make tangible for us, what are we looking for? What is evidence of care versus evidence of designing care out?
Well, I've been at this for, coming from a research background, I am quite meticulous with my data and my insights. So uh, the body of work that I'm loosely calling soft power, that's how I think of care as a concept. So there's over 60 sort of constructs that I've collected and worked through essentially as a data set, but they come or they form across 4 categories, how I think of them. And the overall thing, how I think of care, is there's an infrastructure of care. So I want us to start thinking about care as a strategic tool and as a strategic choice. And so therefore there's a system and a process that we can apply to use that lens and put it over any organizational process that we see. So whether that is a service and we use it in service design, or whether we use it perhaps from a brand perspective or customer experience, more broadly speaking, we look at it in terms of journeys or just the interaction or community engagement. There's so anywhere really you could apply that lens of, okay, there's an infrastructure of care, and what does that entail? There's certain characteristics. So for me, when I think of an infrastructure of care, there's 4 that I can see. So in that ideal organization, and that's a choice, by the way. I don't think it's prescriptive, but it's about how do we as an organization decide to enact these dimensions of that infrastructure or not. So the first one is what I call relational infrastructure. And there's, naturally there's many ways of how we relate to each other. Essentially, how I think about it is how we connect. So what are our ways of connecting? What are our rituals? What do we value? How do we incentivize it? How do we orchestrate? No pun intended. And design for the way that we connect. Okay, so there's one relational aspect to it. Another one is how we pace things. And I think of this as a temporal aspect. So, for example, what are the timelines that I expect someone to come back to me? What are my business rules around, how fast or slow we respond? How much leeway do we give if someone doesn't come back to us? What is the pacing essentially of the interactions that we expect and facilitate with our employees, with our customers, stakeholders, community members, etc. Then the third one is around boundaries, and that is how do we contain essentially our way of being with each other and in the world. And there's again a whole bunch of things underneath or within that dimension. And then the last one brings all of those together, which I think of as a integrative dimension, and that is how do we align? So how do we orchestrate, coordinate, align with one another, all these other dimensions? And so when you look at this together as a whole, or every organization might choose different aspects of this, there's not going to be a one size fits all. But I think what it has in common is that it's not reactive, but it's regenerative, and it's strategic in the sense that this type of organization that chooses to engage in this way should be much more able to absorb stress, but without breaking. So that's one of the advantages. The other thing around an organization that would use those principles is that the hidden things, perhaps hidden cost, that are absorbed by certain elements or people of the organization, they will be harmonized. because they will be brought to the forefront. And so some burdens that at the moment might be, I mean, typically it's frontline workers, for example, or admin kind of functions, they would come more to the forefront, and in harmonizing them, there is more sustainability, less risk, essentially. And also cost saving, really.
And what do you mean by by cost saving?
Well, the thing is, and you and I talked about this a little while back, is that if you have hidden burdens, essentially, whether it's in your workforce or in your customer experience, let's say you're creating a form or a process of interaction with your team members or your customer that forces the work on them. So, for example, it's badly explained, badly designed, convoluted. They have to download 5 things to get to that form. They don't know what it means. They have to ask someone to explain, and no one's, there. We've all been there. And what it does, though, is it costs you as an organization. And so it might cost you retention, attrition, brand loyalty, brand equity, all sorts of things that are just not calculated in that little interaction. And so when you improve and really think it through from a caring lens, chances are that you'll firstly pick up of those interactions or touch points in the first place. And then that secondly, you can do something about it. Now, you can still choose to not do anything about it. So, that's then up to sometimes also the reality of you can't probably fix everything at the same time. But it is still, it's a valuable lens to think through, and then to become curious around, well, if our employees are, exhausted and burned out all the time, what does that mean for our safety or H&S profile, for example? And, that's a really valuable lens and important lens. So if I think, for example, the healthcare context, majority of frontline workers are female. We know that care burden outside of work falls disproportionately on women. So when you then extrapolate that, okay, your key workers, nurses, teachers, etc., already carry a higher load that's invisible and currently not accounted for by economists, and they bring that to work. So they already might be, a proportion of the workforce might already be burned out, and they work in really critical professions, teaching, let's say nursing, so healthcare. People make mistakes. We're not machines yet. And so we know that, burnout outside of work and from work costs essentially safety. So it all can be calculated. And I know I think the ABS is doing some work around that, making the invisible burdens visible. But that's just one example, right? So you can extrapolate that across many other contexts and industries, etc.
One of the things I'm hearing with this is the risk of not caring, which is fascinating. If we think about, organizations are set up for a purpose, and sometimes they're not even thinking about the broader purpose or the broader implications of the role that they play in society, on societal impacts. And then I guess that risk of not caring, we see every day the remnants of that, don't we? Just in the experiences that we have, either working in organizations and having to be the glue between, or when we force people to be the integrator of, and that's us filling in the gaps rather than the organization, I guess, creating, that infrastructure that you talk about.
Exactly. And I think, that works to a point when our social infrastructure in the past, and our community infrastructure was different to what it is today. So what that meant is that people, humans, could go to work and, I mean, firstly, work at a different pace than we do today, and work was structured differently. So the level of exhaustion and of overhead that people experienced at work were much less than they were today. So that's one thing, is that work in and of itself was, yes, of course, still, tiring, etc., but there was a different quality to it. But then the other thing to that is that when people went home eventually, the pacing, like all of these things that I mentioned before, the relational dimensions, etc., they were different than they were today. So and I can't go back to the past as much, but we actually don't need to just go back to the past, but can look at other countries where what the social net, etc., is like there. But before the internet, and particularly perhaps the last, maybe before COVID, life had a little bit more space to it for many people. And with the shift of work, I think there's less space to recuperate essentially outside of work, and then work in and of itself is more draining, perhaps, is the best term. And I don't want to paint a rosy picture in that everything's horrible now and everything was amazing then. But I think that's why I'm very appreciative of the many innovations that we have, including the internet and remote working and etc. But I think the difference is then that there's an aspect of how organizations operate that we didn't need to think about before, and now we just need to be explicit about it. So perhaps, even if an organization took this lens of infrastructure of care or soft power and looked at their interactions with their customers or their staff and just did a bit of an audit, they might look at it and say, no, actually we're good, and everything is fine here. That's hopefully the case for many organizations. And then for perhaps a few, or maybe even more than a few, it might be that, well, actually, how we interact and how we operate is not really sustainable. In terms of the pace, in terms of our incentive structures, in terms of our relational structures with each other, the boundaries that we set or don't set, and the end result, how we integrate this, and how we show up essentially as an organization, that might need some rethinking, or perhaps it might need a bit of space in terms of tweaking and making space for those dimensions. Yeah.
And
what do you think?
I'm thinking about how, if we think about care in the middle, or as an energy source, let's say, and then there's the circles that kind of come from that, which would be the different permeations of sort of where that would exist. And I focus my lens on organizations as entities and what makes them up in and of themselves, but also collectively across organizations and industries, and into then if we look at the unit of an organization and how it's set up to care, and then you have many organizations that are set up to care in all of the permeations that you've expressed, then the knock-on effect of that back into the homes of the people in those communities who are either receiving or working within those organizations the knock-on effect to then bigger, broader impacts like equity, access in both that sort of the physical and the environmental, but also the sustainability of the person and of those communities. So I'm seeing this sort of through line in terms of, I think some people will hear the word care and they'll just roll their eyes and say, oh, it's just, everybody says that they
Yes.
care. But
Yeah.
what you're really talking about is, I think, super critical to actually even being able to function well.
I agree. And I mean, you would hope that everyone cares to an extent. So, I'm not disputing that. That would be very depressing.
Oh, what
In
they
fact, I do
I
think
think I think people say, and then I think organizations say they care, but we have lots of examples where
Mm,
we can point to where organizations say they care, and
mm,
then you're seeing
mm,
unpaid burdens, you're seeing cutting of programs, you're
mm,
seeing there's we don't have to look very far in this landscape to find
mm,
examples of the disconnect between
mm,
saying we care versus caring and
mm,
actually truly living and
mm.
breathing that. So I think what you're talking
Yeah.
about is the real embodiment of these things into
Yeah.
practice, into the infrastructure of organizations.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a lot of thinking is moving in that direction. And the way that I think about, like, for example, I mean, the donut economics and that whole body of work, regenerative future, like, there's whole mountains of work that are being done and have been done for many decades in thinking through how can we really integrate better and balance our needs, community needs, individual needs, planet needs, etc. So I think this is one lens of a truth that has been recognized for our time in many different facets, right? That yes, we all care, but then the enactment of that, or the manifestation of how it's the end result, when I get the form as as the user, you know me, I hate forms. um Forms are evil, but anyway, that's a different story. I suppose my point is that the intent to care is a given, hopefully. I am an optimist, so I do hold that belief. However, where I think the danger is in assuming that a lens such as care is baked in, is that we tend to forget that our systems now are so complex that we can have the best intent and still the outcome or the effect on an individual can be the opposite, can be anything but. I mean, there's countless examples of this. The one that shook me a fair bit a couple of years ago now, but I follow the news around that, is the Robodebt tragedy. And I've worked in these and on these systems, as a strategic designer and a service designer, etc. So I feel, even though I didn't have any direct, or obviously, or orchestrating that scheme, but I know well enough how it can work that even with the best intent and guardrails, that, you know, still the intent was the outcome was the tragedy. And then who is accountable? Or, another example is the awful, it was just in the news today, I think, the inquiry into the Bondi Junction um, massacre, or I don't know what it's called now in the news, but essentially one of the conclusions is that the person, essentially the offender, slipped through the cracks of the mental health system, and it was a series of small, insidious, not even mistakes, but kind of don't even think it was overlooked, but kind of small micro decisions that, when put together, the effect was what it was on this one person. So yeah, that's why I think you can be well intended and but still, if you're not strategic about how does it actually live in the world, how might it affect, maybe like not your immediate circle, but when you're thinking at scale, you have to think quite differently. And we could all do a bit more of that.
I think that's a really important point. I'm thinking about intent versus deliberately not doing something versus deliberately doing something. All connects into what sounds like we actually don't really have a lot of common language, especially when it comes to systems within organizations, in terms of what are all the parts and pieces that contribute to that intent or take away from or get you further away from that intent. And sometimes we don't have an intent at all, and it's just that the combination of these things creates these outcomes, and then we don't have that sensing built in to even see it, recognize it. We have no way of hearing it or engaging in it because we're not looking for it. And so unintended consequences, or at best maybe, and at worst deliberately ignoring outcomes or what that might be. And so I think what would be interesting going into this more, and I know that this is such a interesting and rich space for you that you're exploring. I am curious around how these are not recipes per se, but more what are the types of things, what are the ingredients, or what is the essence of the ingredients or elements that scaffold up into care or make something be more connected to the intent of care. So I'm wondering about some of your thoughts around what kinds of conditions need to be in an organization to actually be able to take this lens on and take these principles on and apply them and live them and use them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I can probably firstly, I agree. We don't have enough language. We do, and we don't, I suppose, have enough language around it. I mean, I know there's a lot of work at a systems level, obviously, in the economic space and social impact space, etc., social innovation space. And the other corner that I tend to look at and look into is leadership, because ideas like servant leadership, etc., they actually are very valuable contributions, and there has been a lot of very good and valuable thinking around it. It's just that where humans are not quite fallible, and I suppose the enactment of that and what we expect from leadership from a handful of people who steer sometimes hundreds of thousands of people's lives and sometimes millions, it's a lot. So our expectations around a human living those values at all times of the day, or those aspirations perhaps, is quite, it's a lot. They're big. So, and I heard I was reading sort of around that topic, that essentially no one wants to be a CEO these days because it's too much responsibility. So it's dropped in terms of what kids used to aspire to. It's probably a YouTuber now. I can't remember.
No, I saw this article.
Judging by my own kids.
No, there was an
Did you?
article. Yes, I saw that, where people who were in positions who were ripe for becoming a CEO were saying, no, thank you. And when asked
Yeah.
why, we're saying, well, why would I want to be in a position where people were waiting and wanting me to absolutely fail? And I just thought,
Yeah. Yeah.
they're
I
not,
mean,
they're not wrong. They're not wrong.
yeah. Yeah. And that's what, having worked with numerous CEOs, that's what the felt experience absolutely can be like. And, it takes a noble human to prevail under those conditions of really permanent stress sometimes. So I think we can't forget that not one person, whatever title they have, or even a handful of people, they actually are not necessarily equipped to make the wisest decisions at all, at always consistently for years on end. And so that my thought around that is that it's really a personal responsibility around how do we enact care in an organization. And again, like, have the same humility towards ourselves or our co-workers, which is, again, easier said than done. When there's time pressure and when there's conflicting ambitions, when there's disagreement, when there's exhaustion, all the things that happen. So I think it's a practice more than anything, and it's a lived value, as we would say, But in the first place, to even try to chip away at it, you need to be a little bit explicit about it, in that to articulate your intent around, okay, well, we want to be a caring organization, and to us that looks like blah. But I mean, quite practically speaking, in terms of the infrastructure of care, of how I think about it. So when I think through, like, the lenses that I've discovered, or that I'm looking at, so relational, temporal, boundary, and the integrative infrastructure, there are some little things that I would recommend for organizations to look at, and that also can be done, that are not necessarily a massive effort. So when I think about relational infrastructure, it's the emotional architecture of a system, right? It's tone, and how do you build trust? What's the language? What are the rituals of how we connect? And that doesn't just take necessarily one person, but it can be as simple as that, setting a different tone in a meeting. And then in terms of time, so how time is structured to allow care, so the pacing and rhythm, and what's the recovery that's embedded in systems. It can be as simple as perhaps using some different words, not always around efficiency, but actually slowness can also be strategic. It is about also kind of checking yourself a little bit around, okay, so, and I'm prone to this. I like to be hyper efficient, call me focused, call me neurospicy, whatever. But when I'm in my zone, I'm the first one to kind of just wanting to be, let's do it. But from a lens of care, is actually having buffers and affording each other some leeway, and really recovery, and embedding that into your structures with your customers, employees, etc., is actually more strategic than just powering through a certain aspect, or expecting fast turnaround or response times for the sake of it. Because it's actually I'm doing some work at the moment around complaints processes. And so thinking a lot about this, well, what's the experience of let's call it feedback, probably nicer, you know, of, does it actually matter? Is it actually about the speed necessarily at all times? Or is it actually about the quality of how someone listens to you? And I mean, I would argue it's probably both, but you can't just be driven around one metric. And so the care lens offers us to also balance the efficiency metric with that. And so particularly when I think about AI and how a lot of the things that we at the moment as humans tinker with or have tinkered in the past around, squeezing, I call it squeezing the lemon, squeezing out the juice is going to be done by machines. And so then you go, well, okay, it's optimized. Does it still deliver, even economically speaking, if I've optimized every process, does that give me a brand advantage in terms of experience? I mean, I would argue no, it doesn't. And it starts with like this sort of simple kind of questioning of, well, what is my time infrastructure, if you want to put it that way? And then the same goes for boundaries. So we have role descriptions for kind of laws around that for a reason. There's now the new kind of right to disconnect, which is a great example of that. So obviously policymakers, and I mean all of us, we can see and feel that workplace is changing, so we need to put some new boundaries, literally through laws and policies in place. So I think people are starting to recognize that. But defining that scope, I work in the care space a lot, in the care economy, as it's called, care space, and so education, aged care, in quite tricky spots as industries. And there's a lot of psychological hazards, even in just delivering a service. I was just looking at the stats. I think 58% of teachers are burnt out. Don't quote me on the number, but roughly, the majority essentially. And burnt out to the point of where it's, a workplace hazard, a psychological hazard. So actually also the interaction with our customers requires that we define our scope of how do we interact here. And so there's safety aspects to that. And it's useful to start thinking about this, that boundaries, they're not barriers to care, but they can be enablers because they make trust and autonomy, they make it possible, really. And then really the last one around the integrative infrastructure, for me, that's really like a cohesion layer. And that's really around, policies and having conversations and putting stories perhaps around the metrics. So the individual metrics that we have across the organizations to connect this and to really, that's that place to think through how does my intent, so from, let's say, corporate, how does that connect to my frontline workforce? And, and vice versa. Because otherwise it's just performative. If it's just a engineered brand experience and it's not connected to the employee experience and remuneration structure, etc., then it's becomes useless in a way. Mm-hmm. So to me, they're kind of they're lived and enacted values, but they do require a bit of intentionality around them first place until it becomes, I guess, you live and breathe it.
Your natural way of being.
What do you think? Yeah, way of being. What do you think?
Well, as you were speaking, I was thinking about earlier, you were talking about when you're in the throes of today, which can be quite a reactive space at worst, responsive at best, I guess, in terms of just ready to deal with whatever is coming, or being reactive and being like, it's really hard to change anything when you're in a reactive stance. Anybody listening can come up with immediate examples of how hard it is to go, let's do something different when we're under pressure,
Right.
it's really
Yeah.
difficult. And so as you were
Yeah.
describing getting some of those elements in place, I was thinking almost around how you might be organizations need to be soft and adaptable. And I can see how building in care is a real asset to being soft and adaptable, because it inherently means you're listening and you're learning and you're adjusting and
Yeah.
adapting, as you said. So I was thinking about the three horizons that organizations really need to be playing in. So one is that the looking back in order to learn, being in the now, the horizon of the now, which is metabolizing the learning and shifting and adjusting real time, and also looking from the third horizon out, more future
And
based, to say, how do we want to be? Where do we want to be? In what ways do we want to be contributing? In what ways do we not want to be harming? So that you can then go, that's what we don't want to be. How are we actually then using that to then assess where we have been and where we are? And so you, but
mm,
you need that temporal space. You actually do need time, and you do need those practices to be able to sense and reflect and learn and do and iterate on that. And I think
mm, right.
another thread in all of that, in terms of what are the signals that you're looking for, or what are you even trying to learn it from, all of this gets tied back to stop trying to guess what you think it means to be cared for or to be caring.
Mm,
Talk to the people, and or
yeah.
talk to the people who are representing those that cannot speak for themselves. Or it's an interesting way to say, it's not enough to have the intent to care. It's not enough to say that you are caring because you feel like,
Mm,
well, I'm doing nice things. It's actually, to
mm,
be really caring is to have that openness to be actually finding out your intent, while of the right place and of the right in the
mm,
right intention, is not manifesting in the way that you would
mm,
like. And actually, there is freedom in the asking and in the exploring and having other people define, this is what care looks like. It's quite freeing, because like you don't actually have to figure it all out yourself. Create care with the people
no,
who
exactly. And you
are impacted.
fundamental, 100%. And that's the integration for me, is that it by necessity, it can't live in a vacuum in your head or in your leadership team's head, because you'll need those people to implement whatever is in your head. And it's better when that's done in exchange rather than post the fact and pointing the finger when things go wrong, as they inevitably always do, because it's life. I would like to think that contemporary management practice is moving towards, a consultative at the least approach, and that modern leadership really requires that skill set as a foundation, really being able to ask in the right way such that it's not biased, establish the safe environment for people to disagree. But you first have to be able to have the insight into yourself as a leader. Are you actually able to, if you're really being honest, you look in the mirror, are you afraid of what you're going to hear? And are you able to face it? So I think there's an integrity piece as well, that enables then that leadership to ask the questions and not be afraid of people having different views. So I agree, it's freeing, and at the same time I also feel for the human, they're trying to the human CEO or leader or whatever, whatever title they might have, that when you are asked to kind of be at the front and visible, etc., it can be quite vulnerable of having to look like you always have the answers. And it requires a certain quality of a leader to be strong enough, paradoxically, to model that actually I don't have all the answers, and that doesn't mean I'm not your CEO. It doesn't mean I'm not your leader, or I don't have an opinion or whatever. It doesn't mean I can't steer the ship, but my style of leadership is actually the one that you described. So I think that's sort of the personal practice of leaders and of each of us to have the ability to check ourselves a little bit and to say, well, where am I maybe a little bit too certain of, what I'm propagating here. But yeah, that might just be the European in me, always questioning.
Oh, well, clearly,
Yeah.
there's so much more to explore in this space, and I'm just really grateful that you are diving more into this and creating language for us to be seeing what you see and helping us to see that as well. So thank you so much, Lena. I really appreciate you.
Likewise, it was a privilege and such a joy to talk with you about my favorite topic, and we have to do it again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.